Welcome to the reform movements, mental health and prison reform, education reform, and the temperance movement study guide. The prison and mental health reform. This reform movement tried to find better conditions for prisoners and for the mentally ill. Dorothea Dix was a teacher. She received her teaching certificate at the age of 14 and opened up her own school. She was a very strict disciplinarian and very hard-working. Later in her life, in 1841, she took a job at Cambridge Women's Prison in Massachusetts. She was appalled at the way the prisoners were treated and the fact that so many of the prisoners were in for what she considered petty crimes, minor theft, public drunkenness, and debt. She also was very disturbed by the large number of mentally ill people that were in prison without having committed any crimes at all. They were only in prison because of their mental illness. She saw these mentally ill people being horribly mistreated, isolated, abused, and she wanted to do something about it. She first brought her concerns to the Massachusetts state legislature, asking for them to create a state mental hospital, and she was ignored. So being a smart cookie, she took her story to the newspapers. Once the story came out in the newspapers, then all of a sudden the legislators were agreeing with her, and they agreed to build a hospital for the mentally ill. Sometimes the newspapers can be our friend. She also convinced many other state legislatures to build mental hospitals, to shorten the sentences for minor offenses, to stop a lot of the cruel punishments that were given to the prisoners and the mentally ill, and to deal with the overcrowding in the prisons. Dix was also responsible for stopping the imprisonment of debtors in the United States. How can you repay your debt if you're in prison and can't work? Education reform also occurred during the 1800s. Before 1820, public schools were very rare. Most students, if their families could afford it, were tutored, or their parents taught them themselves. Many never learned to read and write at all. Teachers were poorly trained and poorly paid, those few that there were. In the early 1800s, New York led the way in early education reform by requiring every town to build a grade school. Unfortunately, attending the school required a small fee, so those who did not have the money were still not allowed to attend school. In Massachusetts, Horace Mann led education reform as head of the State Board of Education. He got states to provide more money for schools. He got states to pay teachers higher salaries. He created 3 teacher colleges to improve the quality of the education of teachers. By 1850, most northern states had taxpayer-funded elementary schools so that every child would have the opportunity to attend. They usually only went up through 6th to 8th grade, but that was more than most children had had prior to that. The South was making some reforms, but they were happening more slowly. African American children were not given the same educational opportunities as white children. To try to change this, both Boston and New York created schools for African American children, but these schools had very little money. Some African American children did go to schools and eventually entered colleges like Harvard, Dartmouth, and Oberlin. And in 1850, the first all-African American college, Lincoln University, opened in Oxford, Pennsylvania. The temperance movement is the last movement we're going to talk about. The temperance movement was the fight against the manufacture and consumption of alcoholic beverages. Alcohol was widely used in the United States during the 1800s, and many people argued that alcohol use led to the breakdown of family, mental illness, and an increase in crime. As a result, the temperance movement, a campaign against the sale or use of alcohol, had a great deal of success. Timothy Shea Arthur wrote a book called 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. And his book was written to demonstrate the evils of alcohol consumption. His book lasted the test of time because even in the 1950s and 60s, a movie was made called 10 Nights in a Barroom. In the 1850s, the temperance movement won a major victory when the state of Maine banned alcohol. 8 other states followed Maine's leads and passed what were called Maine laws. However, despite the fact that women often stood out in front of the bars, keeping men from being able to cross and go in, and asking for their husbands to come out, many states repealed the Maine laws after they saw how unpopular they were with many of their citizens. The temperance leaders did not give up, however, and they fought for an end to the sale and consumption of alcohol. They won more and more and more victories in the late 1800s. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. It made it illegal to use or sell alcoholic beverages in the United States. Unfortunately, it did not quite have the effect that they expected. Instead of getting rid of alcohol use, it actually increased the use of alcohol as people started making underground bars called speakeasies, and they started making bathtub liquor, using stills in their backyards and smuggling liquor in to the state or into the speakeasies. So many people were protesting and fighting against the 18th Amendment. It was very unpopular, and by 1933, the opposition groups had been successful in getting the 21st Amendment passed, which repealed the 18th Amendment, and it was once again legal to make and consume alcohol in America. And now you know a little bit about some of the reform movements that occurred in the 1800s.